invite the next participating delegation, Nepal, to address the court, and I call upon Her Excellency Arzuwa Rana Juba to take the floor.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, I have the great honor of addressing this esteemed court on behalf of the people and government of Nepal. My presence here, along with the members of my team, in the proceedings of this court bears testimony to Nepal's respect for international law, which is one of the key constitutional cornerstones of my country's foreign policy. Moreover, our presence here also underpins the importance that Nepal attaches to the question of climate justice. Thus, Nepal is participating in the proceedings of this august court for the first time today. Nepal's snow-clad mountains, the glorious Himalayas, serve as a natural climate stabilizer for planet Earth. The Himalayas are in fact the third pole and help maintain the health of the oceans. They serve as a heat sink. Moreover, the glaciers and the snow melt feed the rivers, sustaining vegetation, the ecosystem, and the lives of the people living downstream. A large percentage of humanity is dependent on these glacier and snow-fed rivers for their very survival. However, these majestic mountains are being plagued by scanty snowfall and fast melting permafrost in the recent times. This increasing barrenness is a barometer of the catastrophe we are facing today and the challenges we will be confronting in the future. Despite being a key positive contributor to climate balance, ecosystem maintenance, and the protection of biodiversity, Nepal's snow-clad mountains and glaciers are increasingly face jeopardies posed by accelerated global warming and the consequent climate change, even though our own carbon footprint has been and still is negligible. We are having to bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change in a very disproportionate manner. In fact, we are paying for a bad karma we did not create. Climate-induced disasters pose a significant threat to Nepal's development agenda. Not only do these disasters destroy and damage physical infrastructure and homes, they claim lives, uproot societies, and hinder the very realization of fundamental human rights of the Nepali people. Due to the geographical circumstances and the relatively low level of development, Nepal is especially affected by and particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. As the 19th preambular paragraph of the UNCCC clearly states, developing countries with fragile mountainous ecosystems are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. Nepal's vulnerability is further worsened due to the elevation-dependent warming in higher altitudes. This has made the warming in Nepal's mountains even more than the global average. A report by ICJ found that the glaciers in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region could lose up to 80% of their current volume of snow by the end of the century if business as usual continues. The decline of ice cover and permafrost will cause more floods, landslides, and problems for infrastructure at high elevations. Alluding to Nepal's vulnerability, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, made the following remarks while addressing the Federal Parliament of Nepal in October 2023. I quote, "What is happening in this country as a result of climate change is an appalling injustice and a searing indictment of the fossil fuel age." End of quote. It is not just the loss of snow or erratic weather patterns that alarm us. What is more concerning is the harsh suffering that climate change has brought to the lives of the people. And this agony is even worse for women, youth, and children. Mr. President, members of the court, the vulnerabilities that I am talking of are not a matter of theoretical speculation or probability. These are sad realities for the Nepali people and their societies and for those who are victims of changing climate. This year alone, almost 300 citizens of my country have lost their lives due to floods and landslides. To cite just an example, the glacial lake outburst in Thame village in the Everest region of Nepal on the 16th of August 2024 swept away 17 houses and 1 school while displacing 135 households. Allow me to quote the words of Nima Sherpa, a local from the region, who says, "Thame was a beautiful village, home to many generations of Sherpa people and their families. These homes now lie buried under the debris. It is sad to see how the mountain communities are paying the price of the global climate crisis." End of quote. In addition, from 26th to 28th of September 2024, we faced a terrible tragedy induced by incessant and unprecedented rainfall, which claimed over 250 lives and damaged critical infrastructure. Moreover, these climate-induced disasters this year alone has caused economic losses of more than $1.3 billion to Nepal. The damage was mostly to infrastructure related to drinking water, road, energy, irrigation, and the loss of agricultural produce. Mr. President, what countries like Nepal are experiencing is gross injustice. We have been penalized for the mistakes we never made, for the crimes we never committed. However, we have not given up hope or lost faith. We feel adding our voice to the global collective efforts will serve to overcome this existential crisis that humanity currently faces. It is with the hope for climate justice that Nepal attaches great importance to the international processes on climate change. Thus, we have remained fully committed to the global cause of climate action. We are implementing ambitious, nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans under the UNCCC and the Paris Agreement. It is with a similar hope for climate justice that Nepal co-sponsored Resolution 22/276 of the UN General Assembly that requested this August court for an advisory opinion on the questions presented. It is the first request for an advisory opinion from the General Assembly, which was adopted by a consensus. This signals the gravity that the international community accords to these questions. Now I proceed to share Nepal's position on a part of the first question before the court, particularly the state obligations arising from international human rights law. Climate change hinders the realization and the enjoyment of human rights, including the right to life, right to food, right to health, right to adequate housing, sanitation, and water. Moreover, it impacts the rights of women, children, and people with disabilities, as well as the cultural rights of minorities and indigenous communities. The international human rights regime governs particularly the relations between court and individuals, whereas the international environmental law deals with the relations among states. However, in Nepal's view, many vulnerable states are not able to meet the obligations under international human rights laws, as the actions and emissions arising from beyond their territory also have adverse effects on the specific human rights of their citizens. I would also like to stress that Nepal's views on environmental challenges through a human rights framework has been in place even before such issues gained international recognition. As shown by the Godavari marble quarry case of 1995, where the Supreme Court of Nepal upheld that clean and healthy environment is part of the right to life. Furthermore, the Constitution of Nepal 2015 guarantees that every person shall have the right to live in a clean and healthy environment as a fundamental right. Moreover, the constitutional guarantee of the right to life has been further reinforced by the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court of Nepal. However, to fully realize these obligations, we need material, technical, and financial support from the countries whose historic emissions have caused the crisis of anthropogenic climate change. This includes unhindered access to technology and the sharing of meteorological and glacial data. Nepal considers that the Court's advisory opinion will contribute to clarifying the law, especially the obligations of the states regarding climate change and the rules governing the consequences of the violation of these obligations. Mr. President and members of the Court, this concludes my remarks. Thank you for your attention. Now I would like to request you to please kindly invite Mr. Uday Raj Sapkota, Secretary of the Ministry of Law, Justice and Parliamentary Affairs of Nepal. He will submit Nepal's position on a few other aspects of the first question before the Court. I thank you.
Floor to Mr. Uday Raj Sapkota. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the Court, it is an honor to appear before you on behalf of Nepal. My submission will focus on the first question before this Court. In answering the first question, the relevant legal framework comprises the international treaties in the field of climate change, such as UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, international treaties regarding human rights and the rules of customary international law, particularly the duty of due diligence, principle of prevention of significant harms to the environment, and duty to cooperate and assist. First, let me speak on general obligation arising from international law, including customary international law. The general obligation to prevent significant transboundary environment harm is well-established rule in international law. This principle has been clarified by the Court as well, including the jurisprudence of Corfu Channel case and the advisory opinion in legality of the threat of or use of nuclear weapons. This principle of prevention of transboundary harm is based on the concept of due diligence. As this Court has expressed in the pulp mills case, the principle of prevention as a customary rule has its origin in the due diligence that is required of a state in its territory. As the Court has noted, in the said case, such due diligence must be conducted by a state using all means at its disposal. During the current proceedings, we have heard some states questioning whether this obligation is pertinent to climate change or not. Nepal views that this obligation of due diligence applies equally in the context of climate change as well. What makes the preventive principle fundamental is that transcends specific factual context. As has been argued before the Court last week, it cannot be that if isolated sources of transboundary pollution are unlawful, that the most widespread extreme forms such as GHG emissions are not. This should also be understood in the context that the countries responsible for greater amount of emission must take measures to prevent excessive greenhouse gas emissions being emitted from their territory. In this context, Nepal has repeatedly called on the high emitter and industrialized states for reducing their carbon emission. Developed countries must raise their ambitions and fulfill their commitments urgently. This need for raising ambitions brings to me a second crucial point, which is regarding the obligation to make progressive commitments and the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. The treaties of climate change, particularly the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, provide for this obligation. Take as a whole, the Paris Agreement is a legally binding treaty. However, the provisions in this agreement vary in the extent to which they determine the legally binding obligation of states. The long-term global temperature goal set by the agreement is a collective goal. However, this is one of the many modalities spelled out in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. Nepal submits that other modalities include climate adaptation, Article 2.1b, finance flows, Article 2.1c, technology transfer, Article 7. These obligations are also differentiated as per the principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances, CBD, RRC, and C. Among these, the CBD, RRC, and C principle is an important pillar of the Paris Agreement. While establishing common obligations for all parties, the Paris Agreement imposes additional obligations on developed countries. Further, it has given explicit recognition to the special circumstances of the least developed countries and small island developing states. Nepal is of the view that these considerations must be taken into account by the court while expounding on obligations. Further, Nepal submits that the following two factors are relevant regarding the application of this principle. First, share of historical and current global emissions of the states, and second, the overall assessment of the circumstances, vulnerabilities, constraints, and the capabilities of states. As the latter changes, so should the shared responsibility. Regarding the second point, Nepal states also the need to consider specific geographical vulnerabilities and landlocked and mountainous countries, as well as overall economic capabilities and constraints. Equally important to give due consideration to the energy mix, as countries like Nepal are dependent or rely on hydropower, which is exposed to uncertain future precipitation, glacial melting, and potential risks of landslides and glacial lake outbursts or floods. Thus, Nepal views that the court should clarify also the matter of differentiated obligations. Even in the first question asked by the General Assembly simply notes the obligation of states. Further, the third aspect of the state obligation that Nepal would like to stress is the duty of assistance, developed country parties and obligation under Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement to provide financial resources for assisting developing countries in both mitigation and adaptation. It is also pertinent to recall that this article of climate finance using the imperative shall, indicating a legal binding commitment. Nepal views that under this duty of assistance, developed states have an obligation to support the neediest among the developing countries, the least developed, small island, and the mountainous countries. Mr. President and the member of the court, this concludes my remark. Thank you for your kind attention. Now I request you to call Mr. Subhanga Parajuli, Undersecretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Nepal, who will submit Nepal position on the second questions before the court. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Udayaraya Kota. I now give the floor to Mr. Subhanga Parajuli. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, I have the honor to continue the submission on behalf of Nepal. I would also like to take this opportunity to express our gratitude to the youth from all over the world who are critical movers behind these proceedings. With your permission, I now proceed to share Nepal's position on the second question regarding the legal consequences of the obligations. For brevity, my focus would be on the first part of the second question, the consequences with respect to the states injured or specially affected. Some states have characterized the climate crisis as nothing more than a sheer tragedy, where no specific responsibility can be assigned. This perspective persists despite clear scientific evidence identifying which countries have historically contributed the most to greenhouse gases emissions, documented proof of what those countries knew about the consequences of their actions, and when, and undeniable harm climate change has caused, is causing, and will continue to cause. This harm affects individuals, communities, states, and their environments. To suggest that no international wrongs have occurred that would create an obligation to address these harms is, with all due respect, an untenable position. In Nepal's view, for answering the second question before this court, the customary international law on the responsibility of states is the relevant legal framework. In this regard, the law is generally reflected in the ILC's draft articles on the responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts, 2001. As per the ILC articles, every internationally wrongful act by a state leads to the responsibility of that state. Further, two requirements must be met in order to constitute an internationally wrongful act. First, the conduct must be attributable to the state. Second, The conduct in question must constitute a breach of an international legal obligation. Given the diffuse nature of climate change, Nepal considers that question of attribution should look into legal responsibilities of developed countries that have historically contributed to emissions. This is an example of the composite breach as reflected in Article 15 of ILC's draft. Once the breach of obligation is determined, customary international law suggests the remedies, which include cessation of the wrongful act and full reparation. Any state responsible for a breach of an international legal obligation is under an obligation to cease such conduct. Further, reparation may take any of the three forms, namely restitution, compensation, and satisfaction. In this context, my focus here is on the issue of compensation. This court had established in Costa Rica versus Nicaragua case that the damage to the environment and the consequent impairment or loss of the ability of the environment to provide goods and services is compensable under international law. But in the same case, this court said that the specific circumstances and characteristics of each case remain crucial to assess the compensation. Given the composite nature of state responsibility in climate change, the developed countries have a collective duty to compensate for the harm caused by their historic emissions. Nepal is also of the view that this code should look at the operationalization of the fund for responding to the loss and damage mechanism through these lenses of compensating the internationally wrongful act. The states responsible have an obligation to compensate for any financially assessed damage caused by their internationally wrongful act. And in the case of climate change, such obligation must be borne by a collective of industrialized states based on the polluters pay principle. What countries like Nepal are calling for is not mere handouts or charity, but compensatory climate justice. Before I conclude, let me reiterate that the heaviest burdens of climate change are on the shoulders of countries like Nepal, which have historically contributed the least to climate change and have the least capacity for implementing adaptation measures. To repeat the words Honorable Foreign Minister spelled earlier, what we are facing is gross injustice. We have been penalized for the mistakes we never made. The court needs to take these realities into account while rendering its advisory opinion. Given the urgency regarding climate change and the consequences it has on vulnerable states and the generations to come, all states must live up to their obligation in fulfilling and scaling up their commitments. This court's guidance will be crucial in this regard. Thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Nepal for their presentation. I now invite the